Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Authors Bantering. I'm Josh Bresslin, that's Ian M. Rogers. And so this week we have kind of, I think it's a very common problem amongst writers. Certainly, I think it's definitely one of the more crippling aspects, I think, for any kind of creative type, which is imposter syndrome. And so really we're going to talk about what it is and how to overcome it. And to be frank, I think, maybe a different approach to this than maybe other people do. I do tend not to experience it. I don't know about you, Ian, but for me, I don't really ever have the I'm not a real writer thing. My dread about writing is something much different usually, but I guess for you. So do you go through it, Ian?
Yeah, and I think that,
Okay.
you talk about imposter syndrome, like what does it mean to like not trust in your abilities or think that you don't belong someplace? I think that's really common. I definitely go through it now. I think I went through it more 5 or 10 years ago. Certainly when I had fewer kind of tangible results to show as a result of my writing.
Yep.
And when it felt like I wasn't focusing my life around writing.
Got you.
Those things caused me to feel like, oh, okay, I don't belong in certain writing groups or writing communities or having conversations with different kinds of writers.
Hmm.
And I don't know about you, but feeling that way caused me to withdraw and maybe hold back from communicating or starting conversations.
Yeah.
Um, or certainly, like for a long time, I never got in touch with writers whose books I thought were cool.
Yeah.
Even if they were indie writers, it was the idea of like reaching out like that was really intimidating for me, and it just became easier to not do it.
Okay.
Um, and I think a part of me was afraid that if I did reach out, and the person asked like, "Are you a writer or do you write?" I would have to say yes, and then really not have much to show for it, and that held
Yep.
me back for a really long time.
Okay. I definitely know the latter feeling of that. I know I definitely go through those periods of time where people ask you like, "Oh, you're a writer. What books have you written?" Or and you you shamefully don't even talk about it because you don't want to answer that question. I absolutely go through that. I think it's not so much imposter syndrome as it is, at least for me. It's more of just embarrassment that I haven't done anything. It's not that I don't think myself as a writer. It's just embarrassed I don't have such a plethora of stuff out there. And I really think I have the opposite though, where like people also have imposter syndrome where they don't think they're a real writer. I'm like such an arrogant asshole in all honesty that I have the opposite. I'm a real writer. I have not been discovered yet because those guys out there, all the people, all the agents that I query can't see my brilliance. You know what I mean? I've got the opposite. I've got so much of the egotistical, I guess, other side of it that I imposter syndrome never really hits me. Um, it's honestly I think worse in a lot of ways too, but it's not healthy. It's not any more healthy.
Well, no,
Um,
I think that both extremes are not good
yeah,
places to be. And, like you're joking around, but yeah, I think that if the idea that you maybe have that a writer has a different impression about where they are in
yep,
their career can certainly cause some problems, and maybe in the way they present themselves,
mhm,
or I think a lot about how when we have an inflated sense of ego and our self-worth, it often stops us from listening or absorbing new ideas. So it makes it harder to grow because you're not in a position of humility where you're taking on the student role of learning.
mhm,
So, if you're in that, if the writer is in that arrogant kind of mindset, it can and really, really hold them back. That being said, also, I think, being too much in the student mindset, the idea that you have nothing to show for your
yeah,
work or nothing to share with the world can really, really hold you back from having good conversations, from sending your work out there, from telling strangers, that you are a writer and what you're working on, and both can hold you back, I think, in really, really unhealthy ways.
bingo. I think you're right. And so if you're going through imposter syndrome, I think it's important to keep in mind that anybody could come along and just say you're not a writer. Like any schmuck can be like, no, you're not a real writer, you're not a true writer. You can always say, I am writing if you are. And that should be more important, right? Like
Mhm.
it's more embarrassing for me to say that I don't have any work out there or I don't have any work that's finished. it's more embarrassing to say that than it is to say I'm a writer. You know what I mean? Like, you
Mhm.
controlled the first one. Like, in the first time, you know you should be doing better, right? If your embarrassment's over the fact that I don't have a wide range of work, or I don't complete things, that's more of a you thing to work on as far as getting stories completed. If your thing is I write stories but they're not very good, and like, I don't know, I had to self-publish this, or it's just not like, I don't feel like I feel like I'm a real writer like other people are. That type of thing, it's important to recognize anybody can say that. Anybody can come up with some sort of standard to judge you against. But you at least know you're doing the work on your end. If a writer is someone who writes, that is just the plain simple truth of it. Whatever standard for being an author you want to come up with, or someone's come up with, is completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
As long as you're doing the work, judge yourself by that.
Yes, I think that you make an excellent point, and that there's no line between people who are and aren't writers,
Yep.
and any attempt by people to draw that line, I think, is going to have problems, and it's going to get into elitism and sort of
Yeah.
snobbery and all those kinds of things. One thing that I learned a little bit, like kind of a few years ago, is to maybe put my ways of putting myself out there as a writer, but kind of clarifying what kind of writer I was and maybe what I had achieved. So, for example, the saying I'm a writer to a certain kind of person, that conjures up images of, oh, this person has publishes books, and I
Right.
can buy their books at a bookstore, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead of doing that, I would try to present myself in such a way where, one, I would talk about my day job and what I was doing, to kind of earn money. But then I would also talk about, like, oh, and I'm also interested in novels. I have a book manuscript that I'm trying to get published, and I've published some shorter works and things
Yes.
like that. And I would figure out ways to, like, instead of just saying I'm a writer, to try and like tell a little story to convey like what kind of writer I was and what stage I was at in my career.
Yep.
And this was somewhat interesting because sometimes when I did this, people would kind of ignore the writer part and they'd want to hear about my day job. Or sometimes they would maybe like want to know more about my writing, kind of what stage I was. So it like
Yeah.
allowed people to pick and choose kind of which part of the story they were more interested in, like which part of my identity they were more interested in. So the thing I learned about that was it was a maybe more effective way to start the conversation, as opposed to just saying I'm a writer, and then when people ask what have you written, you'd be like, well, and you'd have to explain or give qualifiers.
It's hard. No, it's again, it's being a writer is one of those things where you can't have like a secondary identity and with the same leniency other people would, right? Like, if you say like yeah, I play basketball on the weekends, right? No one's
Mhm.
expecting you to ask how many games your team, or I play softball, right? Like, no one asks, hey, how many softball games have you won this season, right? You just go, oh, it's cool, right? If you're a writer,
Mhm.
everyone, there's always an expectation that if you're a writer, that you have something completed for, and often it's out of sense of love, right? Like, oh, I'd love to read it. Rarely, the odds of someone actually reading your work when you find out is pretty low. Like, they always, like, in theory, say, I'd love to read your work. They never get around to doing it, right? But it's always an expectation of having something to produce whenever you say you're a writer. It's a weird label to put on yourself, unfortunately. But it's it's a matter, I think, of wondering what you share it with, who you share it with. But a deeper thing, though, I still maintain, is just forget the label. If you're putting words down, you are a writer, and just go
Yes.
forward. Um,
Yes, I think that writers shouldn't put pressure on themselves to kind of match a certain definition,
yep.
or to conform to a certain level of success or way of presenting yourself before you're ready to do that. And if you're listening to this and you're at a stage where you're just experimenting with writing or figuring out your craft, or finishing a work, you know be honest with yourself about that and say, okay, this is where I'm at. You're not up here and you're not down there, but try and feel comfortable at the level you are, and then try and figure out ways of presenting that level that can reveal accurately to yourself. Try and figure out ways of presenting that level you're at with the world in
Yeah.
ways that feel natural to you.
Bingo. No, I agree. And yeah, I mean, what else can you really do? To be honest, like that's it's one of those things where it's more of a, I don't want to say simplistic situation basically, but it is one of the things where there's only so many ways to address it. Um, awesome work, man. So I think we'll leave it right there. Uh, with that, if you've enjoyed, obviously, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And with that, we'll be back next week. So I'm Josh Breslin, and that's Ian M. Rogers.
Take it easy.